Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 87, we sit down with Jane Lear, a talented food writer and editor. Jane shares her journey from childhood to her early passion for journalism and writing, and how that led her to college and eventually to New York City to pursue a career in publishing. She reflects on her experiences meeting culinary legends like Julia Child and her time at Gourmet Magazine, along with her freelance work for other prestigious publications. We also dive into her role as editor at Feed Me, Newsday's magazine for Long Island food lovers. And lastly, we discuss her hopes for the future of the North Fork. So I hope you enjoy episode 87 with Jane Lear. This episode was recorded July 2nd, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Chris, it's just such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So I'd like to start off with, if you could give us a brief introduction about yourself, where you were born and raised.
I'm Jane Lear. I am the editor of Feed Me Magazine, Newsday's quarterly for Long Island food lovers. Covers both Suffolk and Nassau counties. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, but I grew up down south. North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, kind of around and about.
Okay. And did your parents grow up in Ohio or in the South?
No. Well, my mother did, but they lived down south pretty much, well, their whole lives. My mother was a teacher and an editor, and my father was an Episcopal priest turned newspaper editor. And they both were just very passionate about language and education. They divorced when I was fairly young, and my mom died when I was in high school. So when I was in college, my dad remarried, and I acquired a fabulous stepmother who was also a journalist. And, you know, it was great after I'd sort of established myself in my career to be able to have that sort of professional camaraderie with both my father and my stepmother. It was fun.
Yes. And in terms of your childhood, how was your experience as a child? And could you describe the neighborhood or community you grew up in?
Oh, gosh. It was basically your, small town America South. I rode horses and I read. That's pretty much all I did. And one of the things I remember most vividly is that my parents had, a big Webster's Unabridged dictionary, second edition, I think. And they had it on an old-fashioned dictionary stand. And they kept a stool next to it. So if I ever asked what a word meant, they would just say, go look it up.
Wow. That's a good way to get started with just getting you into that mode of, or that habit of looking up new words instead of just asking someone. And then how was your schooling experience, whether it was through elementary, middle school?
Oh, it was fine. It was, kind of a blur. This was back during the time when parents basically ignored their children, for huge chunks of time. And what I discovered in school, I think, was that I liked learning stuff. And looking back, I'm really happy that I found a career that enabled me to get paid for learning every day.
And were you interested in, because of your father's profession, were you already interested in journalism or in terms of food writing?
In terms of journalism, I think I was always interested because it was just such a part of growing up. I mean, I learned to read sitting on my father's lap and, pointing out words in the newspaper or a magazine. My parents subscribed to American Heritage and Look and Life and all of these great magazines and would talk about stories. And, it was just, I don't know, it was just kind of part of the everyday conversation.
Yeah. And so coming out of high school, what were you thinking of possibly doing in terms of your either where you wanted to go? Were you thinking you wanted to leave that area that you grew up in?
Yeah. By that point we were living in Virginia, and I just wanted to go someplace I'd never been before. And back then, of course, the whole college process was so much less fraught than it is today. And of course, it was much less expensive. So I don't know, I just thought, well, I wanted to go to a big state university. And so I ended up at Indiana University in Bloomington because they just had a lot of stuff I was interested in. They had a great journalism school. They, had a great liberal arts program, great sciences, and they had a terrific, very international student body. So I loved it. And looking back, it made a transition. Going to a huge state university made the transition to New York City a lot easier because you use so many of the same strategies, just getting around, And also thinking of a huge, sprawling, unwieldy group of people as various neighborhoods. And there are parts of it you want to be a part of and parts of it you don't. And it's pretty easy to carve out an interesting life for yourself.
Yes. And what did you end up getting your bachelor's in?
Anthropology.
Oh.
And but I also it was great because it gave me a license to just poke my nose into all sorts of interesting things. And I also had a great interest in the sciences and did a lot of science reporting for the Indiana student paper as well as the Bloomington paper. And so I was a stringer for the Indianapolis paper. So it was fun.
And in terms of coming out of your bachelor's degree, did you know what you wanted to do?
Yeah, by then I had planned to go on to J school at the University of Missouri. And for my college graduation, my father had suggested he would give me a publishing short course. And there was one at Sarah Lawrence that sounded very interesting, and it was close to New York City. And so I spent a summer there being introduced to all these incredible publishing people.
And was that your first time visiting New York City?
Well, no, I had actually been to New York back when I was in high school with a couple of cousins, and but that was, just not a long trip. It was very, very heady, those early days in New York, I have to say.
And what was the time frame or what year was that about that you had moved to New York?
I came to New York in August of 1978. So, and looking for an apartment, there was a newspaper strike. So you basically looked for an apartment by seeing signs up on telephone poles and you tear off the number and call. So it was I totally lucked out, and within 2 weeks I found a job and I found an apartment. And I'd already realized by then how rare that sort of thing was. And I just sort of decided I could not leave and go to graduate school. I was.
You're like, I'm set in New York now.
Yeah. I'm set. I'm not giving up this apartment. You would have had to pry the keys out of my cold dead hands.
Because that was an interesting time in New York City. And,
it was.
I mean, were they coming out of a financial situation?
Oh, it was horrible. It was absolute. It was filthy. It was dangerous. It was really quite something. And my roommate, who I'd met at Sarah Lawrence, I'd gotten a job at Alfred Knopf, and she got a job at Random House. And so we walked to work together. And her job was in the children's department, and she got to write back to all the children who wrote into Walter Farley, the author of the Black Stallion books.
Wow.
And
oh my God.
it was the coolest thing. Wow. And but then we'd walk to work together, we'd walk home together, and we were both pretty much the same size. So we would rinse out this was back in the day where you wore a skirt and a blouse and a floppy little tie. And we would rinse out our blouses and then trade the next day. We traded off clothes,
Wow. Because you didn't have to, I mean, it was, you were supposed to come in.
And they pay, an editorial assistant, made nothing. So I actually had a number of other jobs. I cater waitered. Yeah, I cater waitered. I was a waitress on the cruise ships that, left from 23rd Street. My roommate walked dogs. We just did all sorts of things to earn a little extra cash.
Yeah. And so how long were you at Alfred Knopf?
I was there for 2 years. And it was amazing. The world-class writers that went through the halls on a regular basis, that was my graduate school. I have to say it was just incredible because you just, learned what to do and learned what not to do. I also met a lot of cookbook authors because that was, it was Julia Child and Edna Lewis and Marcella Hazan and Lori Colwin, Maida Heater. They would all come through. We were publishing all these marvelous cookbooks. And of course, Judith Jones was their editor.
Do you remember some of those experiences? Did you get to talk with them? Julia Child?
Julia Child, it was so fun. She, I was the assistant to the publicity director. And he was supposed to take her out to lunch one day, and they got their wires crossed. So he had gone, he wasn't there, and she came by, expecting to go out to lunch with Bill, and he wasn't there. And she sort of stared at me, and she said, "Well, I'm very hungry. Would you like to go to lunch?"
Oh, wow.
And we went to the Automat. And it was wonderful.
Did you pick that place?
No, we just sort of talked about it. And I think she mentioned it, and I said I'd never been. And she, we must go there. And Lori Colwin was another one. She was edited by Victoria Wilson, and just a marvelous novelist. And was just so down to earth and so friendly. And by this point, I was living on my own, and I invited her to dinner. She was just entranced by, my Southern accent, which was a lot stronger back then, so we had just kind of had a rapport. Well, I invited her to my apartment for dinner, and she was just, she said, of course I'll come. And I think I made a gumbo. And we just talked about everything. She was passionate about girl groups, and we went, had a long chat about that, and beautiful soup plates, and English china, and we just kind of went on and on and on. And then 2 days later, I walked into the office and there was a present on my desk, and it was a paring knife, a Wusthof paring knife. And the note said, "Thank you for a wonderful evening. You deserve a great knife." And I still have it. I use it every day.
Incredible.
And then it was really fun. By the time I got to Gourmet some years later, she was writing a column for the magazine. And I was one of her editors there. So it was really, it was fun to renew the acquaintance.
And even just at that age and meeting all these well-known food writers and cooks must have just talking with them one-on-one and going out to must have been just, I can see why you were probably almost like, I'm staying in New York now because this is a great experience. But you said that you eventually moved on to Gourmet Magazine, but just getting into the industry and meeting these people.
It was fantastic. I mean, I did realize about 2 years in that books were great, but I wanted something a little faster paced. And I had just always, I don't know, I'd always loved magazines. They're just a window into a different world.
Yeah. And then how did that opportunity come about to work for Gourmet Magazine?
I was at Antiques Magazine at the time. I've been there about 10 years. And a friend had come into town, and it turns out we were talking about magazines we loved. And I said, well, I grew up with Gourmet. My mother, truth be told, she was always more interested in the garden than the kitchen, but it was certainly a touchstone for her. And his face just lit up, and he said, it wasn't his aunt. She was like a step aunt, some extended relation, works there. And he said, "You've reminded me I've got to call her while I'm in town." And it turns out he did, and mentioned that he'd met a longtime fan. And she said, "You have her call me." And by that point, the editor-in-chief was retiring. They were having sort of a whole shuffling. And there was an opening for an assistant editor. And I don't know, we just hit it off.
And what were you focused on in that position?
At that point, we were, none of us really functioned as acquisitions editors. We basically, there was a whole stable of writers, and we took turns. I mean, certainly, if someone had particular expertise, one editor was fluent in French and Italian, another had lived in or traveled in Asia very widely. So I kind of staked out the American South. And, and then maybe 10 years on, there was another changing of the guard, and Ruth Reichel came on. So as the editor.
And just thinking back in terms of even your childhood, where do you think your interest came for food? And not so much writing about it, but just your early interest in cooking and food.
Oh, I think, this was back in the day when, we didn't really go out to restaurants. There was no such thing as, the only takeout food was barbecue, and so, my mother cooked every day, and also we just had always such interesting conversations around the dinner table. And it was, my parents had interesting friends, and it was just, you sat down to dinner and you had, an interesting time of it.
And how long were you at Gourmet Magazine?
I was there for almost 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah. The magazine folded in 2009.
And so you were going through the 90s, 2000s, 2000. But I was just curious about, before we moved to Newsday, just your own experience going through New York City through that time and kind of in the food scene and how it might have changed or evolved over that time.
Oh, it was incredibly exciting. The restaurant scene was very, very vibrant, and just the availability of ingredients. I mean, when you think back, like in the early 90s, what it took to get a decent olive oil or a decent red wine, and in terms of, to me, I think one of the real stories is, this explosion of ingredients from, all over the world that were getting more and more and more available. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, one of the forerunners there was the Silver Palette on the Upper West Side, and also what was it? Was it a Gristedes? It was a supermarket right by the UN, and they had these aisles filled with all these canned or jarred ingredients from all over the world for the UN crowd.
Wow.
They were so homesick. You could get, umpteen different kinds of, pickled beets or whatever, or potted meats. Yeah. And it was very interesting. And then you had, of course, just a great restaurant culture. Although I have to say, at Gourmet, the writers, when I think back on kind of my own stable of writers, I wasn't all that interested in food writers as a genre or travel writers, but what I was really, really interested in were writers good writers who could write about food and travel in interesting ways. Mm-hmm.
But you still focused on Southern.
Well, okay. It was actually, by that point, it was just very, very broad. Okay. Very, very broad. I mean, and I would just I had a notebook of story ideas, and I had a notebook of potential writers. And I just that I carried around for years. I mean, I still do that. Mm-hmm. And, just kind of matched people up. Like we were doing, we did a special issue on Rome. And I knew that John Guare, the playwright, his wife was head of the American Academy in Rome. And I figured he spent a lot of time there. So I reached out to him and I said, what would you be interested in writing about in Rome? And I said, one idea that I have always found appealing is looking at art in situ, that is, in churches. Looking at great art in churches. And he said, I've always loved doing that. And he just went and did it for us. It was great. It was a wonderful piece.
And also, while you were living in New York this time, did you have any favorite neighborhoods or restaurants that you would frequent quite often?
My favorite, I lived on the Upper East Side. I lived on the most boring part of the most boring neighborhood in Manhattan. And so my favorite neighborhood joints were always in different neighborhoods. I always needed to take the subway, whether it was, down to the Village or Tribeca or, wherever.
Mm-hmm. And also moving forward, had you visited the North Fork or South Fork at this time between then and 2009?
Oh, yeah. I would come out occasionally to see friends. Early on, it was not part of my experience, but I would come out mostly to the North Fork. I used to race sailboats, and we would sailed out of Shelter Island a few times, a few summers, and it just really kind of spoke to me here.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say you initially thought of the North Fork when you first came out? Was that in the, I don't know if you can remember the exact year, like in the 80s and 90s?
Well, I started spending, when was that? Maybe the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just very rural. I loved it. And to me, I loved the salt marsh.
Mm-hmm.
It reminded me of Savannah. And I loved the vistas. But I loved the whole rural character of it.
Mm-hmm. And now moving forward, after your time at Gourmet Magazine, we might be skipping a little bit in between there, but how did you become editor of Feed Me at Newsday?
Well, after Gourmet folded, I spent some time at Martha Stewart Living as I pretty much freelanced for all the Martha Stewart magazines, and but was features director at Living, and then I was freelancing for just, I don't know, a whole bunch of magazines, and did some ghostwriting in terms of on cookbooks. And by then, my husband and I had bought what we thought was a weekend house out here, and ended up spending a lot more time out here than we'd initially thought. I was working on a big cookbook project, so I could kind of do that anywhere. And, he was, up to his earlobes in trying to salvage a garden. And that was, I think that was around 2011. So I was freelancing and bopping back and forth between the city and here. And then we got a puppy, and it became very, very difficult to leave. And I also kind of I came to the conclusion that at my age, no one in New York magazine publishing was going to hire me full time, and most importantly, pay me what I was worth. So I thought, okay, what can I do out here? And in the meantime, I got a really fun job at the Village Cheese Shop in Mattituck. So I was working part-time there, and connected with a woman who was one of the food writers at Newsday. Well, so then I ended up meeting the rest of the food team there, and we really clicked. And I knew I could make a beautiful magazine for them.
Because they didn't have a magazine at the time.
Well, I think they'd had various magazines, like they had a real estate magazine. They had all sorts of little things, but they were very interested in expanding their food coverage. And, it's just always so thrilling to come across people who are interested in publishing an actual physical magazine these days. It's like, yay, I can do this for you.
Yes. And so that was your main focus going into that job, creating that magazine for all of Long Island?
Nassau and Suffolk counties, yeah.
Now, as editor, what are your guiding principles for selecting content and stories to feature in Feed Me?
Well, part of being an editor is that you're a gatekeeper, essentially. And first and foremost, our readers are interested in where to go to eat good food. And they seem to enjoy getting into the kitchen, too. I will say, in general, our audience is there because the food writers, we all try to keep a strong focus on good storytelling and compelling characters. And I've always felt that putting together an issue of a magazine is like putting a good meal on the table. At the end of the day, you want everybody to be happy and satisfied and taken out of their lives a little bit by the pleasures of the table.
Yes. And thinking about Long Island you meant Nassau and Suffolk and some of the vibrant culinary scenes. How do you approach covering such a diverse and dynamic food culture?
I have to say, I'm very grateful. When we published the first issue, which was in the summer of 2018, honestly, I gave it a year, maybe two, because frankly, I just thought everybody would run out of stuff to write about.
Mm-hmm.
But I was really wrong. And the culinary and cultural depth and diversity on Long Island just is a source of amazement and delight for me. It keeps evolving. Here's a good example. The fact that we can produce an issue on Chinese food on Long Island, which appeared in the spring of 2023, and include restaurants making authentic regional food from all over China, blows me away. It just blows me away. Yeah. And the food writers at Newsday know Long Island so well. And I love the fact they're all generalists to a certain degree, but one has traveled widely in both China and Italy. Others have traveled in Mexico, Central and South America. They are familiar with a variety of cultures. Mm-hmm. And they also, I think, most importantly, know how to make a restaurant experience come alive.
Mm-hmm.
One thing. I would like to add that I love the fact that they are all so inclusive. The days when the only interest is in, so-called fancy restaurants or fine dining, those days are gone forever. And they are always on the prowl for great food, no matter how humble the restaurant is or in, what nondescript strip mall it's in, And one of the comments I have gotten with great regularity from readers is, I've driven by that place 1,000 times and I never stopped. I never knew that was a good restaurant. Mm-hmm. And, that sense of discovery it keeps people coming back. Mm-hmm. And it certainly keeps me interested.
Yes. No, I think it's always, you can't judge it by the outside. And
exactly.
And then having all those rules or that you would follow, looking at more of the fine dining and what you're expecting, that goes out the window when you're looking at a more vibrant and diverse group of restaurants. And looking at it from a different lens, I think, is important.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the part about you had a issue with China. Mm-hmm. But can you share any other memorable or standout moments from your time working at Feed Me?
Well, I've been in the food magazine business for decades now, and what the restaurant industry went through during the pandemic was really catastrophic. Mm-hmm. And I suppose one silver lining, if you can call it that, is that lay people, I think many for the first time, became aware of the connection between restaurants and their local economy. And they also gained some insight into everything that goes into the restaurant meal that is placed in front of them. Mm-hmm. It's from lettuce pickers, farmers, ranchers, distillers, and in the restaurant, bussers and dishwashers, line cooks, chefs. For the most part, these are very unsung jobs and undervalued. Mm-hmm. And I think people always love a backstory, and to be able to gain those insights, I think was important.
Mm-hmm. And did you have something?
I almost forgot. Another thing I love is when readers reach out to me because, it just is sort of in real time. I'm getting feedback and totally unscripted feedback. And one woman called me out of the blue after we published the Italian issue because there's such a rich Italian American community on Long Island. And we published that in the spring of 2022. And she talked about how that issue provided this surprising bond with her children because she got all excited because in one, we did a story about, a handful of like those pizzerias that have the dining room in the back or on the side, they're all over Long Island. Yes. And she and her husband had their first date at one of the places we mentioned. And her kids for some reason, it just blew them away. And so they just sort of had this whole long conversation about it. And the restaurant is still there. It's slightly changed. But, they were she had to call and tell me that. And I thought, wow, it's so nice to strike a chord that way.
No, definitely. That's a nice connection. And now moving forward and you're observing Long Island from 2018 to now, what trends do you see shaping the food and dining landscape of the region?
It's so funny. I was just talking to a couple of colleagues about that the other day. And one trend is restaurants that serve brunch all day. And I don't know why. People maybe want permission to eat pancakes and drink mimosas all day long. I don't know. Again, the authentic regional Chinese just has built up a huge head of steam, which is fantastic. Ramen shows absolutely no signs of slowing down. Artisanal pizza, again, just going like gangbusters. Craft cocktails, another trend. I mean, those are, how long does something have to last before it's not a trend anymore? I don't, but they are just going like gangbusters. And interestingly, I think you also have a tendency toward luxury, like relatively accessible luxury. When it does come to the fine dining realm, people, they're in a place where they want to indulge and they're willing to pay for it.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I definitely I've noticed some of what you've mentioned, even with the ramen and the artisan pizza, has definitely picked up, I think, all over the United States too, but especially on Long Island. And with food writing, it often goes beyond just reviewing restaurants. What other aspects of the culinary world do you explore in Feed Me, and why are they important?
Well, one of the great things about food is that you can use it as a prism to look at all sorts of things in a very subtle way. Race, gender, class, agriculture, the politics of the plate, the whole world, really. And here on Long Island, you have so many immigrant cuisines mentioned that are represented here. English, Irish, Polish, Italian, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Mexican, the countries in Central and South America, the Caribbean, African. These cuisines are all a part of the Long Island food scene, and I think they continue to evolve, and we as consumers all continue to evolve. I think in general, it's fair to say that it's never been a more interesting time to eat in the United States as a whole, or regionally here on Long Island.
I think there's so much more to pick from than even going back 20 years, I think there's just, it's unlimited in the amount of different cuisines and cultures. And what advice would you give to an aspiring food journalist or editors looking to make an impact in the field?
Oh, well, you need a good palate, for starters. You need a capacity for discernment and nuance. I think it's important to enjoy the research process. The late, great Jonathan Gold, who really mapped out Los Angeles for foodies and who wrote for Gourmet back in the day, he had a reputation for research that was legendary. Mm-hmm. He owned thousands and thousands of cookbooks. And if he was going to go to a Muslim Thai restaurant, for instance, he would read everything he could get his hands on about it before he went and ate and then wrote about it. And I think I'd add that I think it's very important to be willing to step back from what you know and from what you think you know in order to get a historical context. I also think it's really, really important to immerse yourself in good writing, to just soak it up. You know, Jonathan Gold, of course, Laurie Colwin, Calvin Trillin, Joseph Mitchell, A.J. Liebling, M.F.K. Fisher. There's a great starter set right there. And all so much more than just food writers. And then I would be remiss if I didn't include great environmental writers who have written about various aspects of the food world. Michael Pollan, of course, Wendell Berry, Barry Estabrook. You know, that too is a very important kind of subgenre. And specifically as to the work of editing, well, I think one key is to be a very careful, responsive reader. If you're not, you can't see problems, and you certainly can't fix them.
Yes. And before I get to the next question, I had a question about even the future of Feed Me and possibly what ideas you might have for the magazine or hopes for the future down the line.
Oh, gosh. Well, you know, I think we are doing a wonderful job of covering this ever-changing food scene. And, you know, there is a need out there, I think, even in this day and age of everything, you know, people want everything really fast, everything at their fingertips. There is still I think there's room for it all, you know, and I think there is a real place for a beautiful magazine that is full of great reads that create a sense of place. People want to slow down and be taken out of themselves a little bit. And when you have this beautiful tactile object, and one of the things that is so popular is our trail map. We've done it since the very beginning, and it's illustrated by a wonderful Newsday artist, and it's perforated so people can tear it out and keep it in their cars. And we have covered everything from barbecue and craft beer to, you know, gelato and just all sorts of things, all throughout Long Island. And it is hugely popular. And it just is, it's the sort of thing that doesn't necessarily translate in the digital realm. People want to hold it in their hands and look at it.
And I've used that before, and I think I love maps in general. So, and then even just a map that's created and then curated with different cuisines or food. It's much nicer to see that than just typing in, say, on Google Maps and saying, "Oh, right, what are the best?" But this gives it a nice, clear format for people.
It's kind of like in a way, it's It's kind of like going into the open stacks of a library. You are looking for one thing in particular, but so often what you discover you really need is the book next to the one that you were going after. It's like, I thought I was in, the mood for this, but this is what is really speaking to me now.
Yes. And now just focusing on the North Fork, I had a question that I was just curious what your thoughts are of the North Fork and its food scene, and possibly if that's changed since you've come out here, and what you might see for the future of the area.
Well, it certainly has changed. I mean, when we first came out here, the only place that was open past, 8 o'clock in the evening was O'Malley's. And I do think the restaurateurs out here and the chefs have done a tremendous job. I mean, they have access to pristine seafood and just stellar ingredients, in terms of, we have a fairly long growing season. And I just think the food scene out here is very interesting. I would love some spicy food closer.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care what,
Just something a little spicier.
But, on the whole, and I think, especially coming back from the pandemic, I'm grateful for every restaurant out here.
And just for looking to the future of the community as a whole, what do you hope for the North Fork and its community down the line?
Oh my God. It's so clear we're at a crossroads out here. You'd have to live under a rock to not be aware of that. We're all trying to balance housing, local business needs, incredible development pressures, agriculture, in particular marine agriculture, which I find so fascinating. And I don't mean, I mean, yes, obviously oyster growing and shellfish growing, all of that sort of stuff, but also farms that stretch down to the water. It's a rare commodity in the Northeast, very, very rare. And I think the preservation of the rural character of the North Fork, that to me makes this place so special. And it would just, it would be impossible to replace if it were gone.
Yes.
So I think there are no easy fixes. And I think smarter, more tuned in, more dialed in minds than mine are out here working on that very hard. I do hope for an overall mindfulness.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I did have just one last question, more so I'm just curious with some people reflecting on their career and your initial start in New York City and working through different areas within publishing and magazine and writing about different restaurants and food, and coming out here and starting a brand new magazine at Newsday. Just your career as an editor and food critic within journalism. What have you enjoyed most about your career and looking back?
Well, helping writers say what they mean to say. And I don't know, I've just met so many extraordinary people. I also love the actual craft of editing. And as I said earlier, I get to learn stuff every day. I'm not tired of it yet.
And then you always have new ideas and...
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And I just ask if there's anything else you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't talked about.
Gosh, I think we've covered pretty much everything.
Yes, definitely. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast and share your story and fascinating journey within the food world, as well as your involvement on Long Island and the North Fork within the food scene and all the wonderful work you've done in the area. So I want to thank you so much.
Oh, Chris, thank you so much. Next time, let's have lunch.
Absolutely.
I'm really hungry after all of this.
Yes.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 87 with Jane Lear. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.